Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. I love studying history. The reason I love studying history is that you can kind of dig back into the past and try to understand the actions and the activities of individuals that were involved in markers in time, particularly when it comes to battle history. It's something I enjoy. I enjoy visiting old battlefields and trying to understand the numbers of people, the interactions, the level of violence, I think, what weapons were used, and such as that. And when you have people that kind of sit there and they have studied the battle, and they have, from their perspective, they've been able to interpret what they have seen, and they've written it down. First-hand accounts are absolutely amazing. It's something special because that moment is, in fact, frozen in time. It's a moment that is gone, but for those moments, as I'm reading over it, I'm transported back into time, and I can appreciate what individuals went through, the individual soldier on a battlefield, for instance. Today, though, we've got another document, though, a document that does, in fact, describe what has now become a historic event. Sadly, this historic event documents the results of a massacre that took place several years ago now. And it's actually a document that I think we never thought we would see. Right now, we're going to talk about the autopsy reports in the cases of the Idaho 4, otherwise known as the Idaho Massacre. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Brother Dave, I didn't necessarily think, I guess, well, I think part of me thought that we would see autopsy reports at some point in time, and that, they've been kind of slow rolling a lot of things.
Yeah.
Some of it's been quite shocking. And I'm not being met, I don't think right now, with the same level of shock that we'd seen previously, but these documents that were in fact released just a few days ago are as shocking as anything involving these cases that we've come across to this point, because they are truly a scientific descriptor of the injuries that were sustained by these 4 college kids.
We didn't see it coming either. And it was July 2nd last year when Kohberger changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. And during that time, I thought that there would be an allocution. There would be an explanation that we could find out not just what happened, but why, which, again, you and I have talked about. We don't need the why. It's a bothering term. But in this case, what motivated Bryan Kohberger to do what he did? I think there's a lot there that could be examined, but you and I have both done this case so much that the idea of having to mention that guy's name again just drives me batty, because the victims here, we have got to stick with them. With Kaylee, I think she was the target in this whole thing. And by the way, just my opinion, my thought. Kaylee Goncalves, and Madison Mogen were together, Joe. Xana and Ethan were together, and then we have the other 2 people in the house. But, Maddie and Kaylee, they were up on the 3rd floor, and I've always thought one of them was the main target, okay? I want to be crystal clear on this, that we don't know, because Kohberger was never forced to tell us, which I don't know how that works. I'd really like to find out.
I would too.
because I just think they did a disservice to the families. But I'm not going to speak for the families. They can all do that for themselves. But
Please allow me to interject here, if you will. I'll speak to prosecution. I think it's gutless. I really do.
Yeah.
You've gone this distance, and you can't go the rest of the way to compel this subject to talk about what he did. And there's never an answer to why. I'm glad that you brought that up. But I think what happened would have been a bit more satisfying, I think, for everybody involved. And it doesn't matter if you or I know what happened, but I think in that courtroom where, some of the family members showed up, now that's not gutless. That's an indication of their resolve, I think. And they were done a disservice that day when this individual was not compelled to talk about what occurred that night, even the sequencing of it, what was or who was the target, perhaps. Uh, I'm not necessarily interested on any level for his greater motivations. I don't care if if he's sitting there in some cell somewhere, contemplating the fact that he didn't get enough attention as a child or any of this sort of thing. Because, it's kind of like a dog chasing its tail.
Yeah.
It might catch up with it at some point in time, but it's less than satisfying intellectually because it'll be the same thing over and over again. And I think that many people, behaviorists in particular, it's like, well, there are certain predictive behaviors, that we could examine and maybe come back with a formula to prevent this from happening again. We've had decades now of these studies of these individuals, and when they start talking about predictive behaviors, if we are to believe what we have heard about Kohberger, you know, there were indicators of predictive behaviors, I think, and he was never interdicted. These 4 kids were butchered, as as is described in these autopsy reports that we're going to talk about. And that didn't help us, did it? But to try to understand what happened that night, the most satisfying piece to that would be for the families to have an understanding of that. Because I can tell you, having spoken with some of the families, the why, I don't think is going to satisfy anything, any thirst that they might have. They want to know what occurred that night. What was it that caught his eye in those moments or prior to those moments? His motivation is something that, again, that goes back to him. And this is not about him. It's about these kids at the end of the day. He's had a lot of ink slung about him, as the press used to say. A lot of camera time. People asking these big, broad questions. But again, for Body Bags and what we talk about on the show, our big motivation is going to be telling stories of the deceased. That's who literally has to have life breathed into them, a remembrance, if you will. And I think that's very important because even with serial killers, for instance, that people beat the drum about a lot. You go to conferences and these sorts of things, and you hear these stories. They're almost ghost stories, I think, and they start talking about serial killers. It's like I would be hard pressed to give you specific names of Bundy's victims, other than my friend Kathy Kleiner, who's a survivor. I can't sit there, to my great shame. I can't sit there and tell you the names of those victims, but we remember Bundy's name, don't we? John Wayne Gacy. The only reason we know his victims' names is because there's been documentaries that have been done, but he still trumps all of the victims, right? And I think that, wouldn't this be a great starting place if we no longer remembered his name that is now doing time in the penitentiary, uh, but yet we remember the victims that died in that home that
And
night, Dave.
as we do this episode, okay, the autopsy reports have been released. And the person that did the autopsy, she was going to testify in court.
Mm.
And this is material that we would have seen and heard in court, that by Kohberger taking the guilty plea and everything else, we're not going to see, or I thought we were not going to see, but it was released. And so as we look at these today, what you take away from this is really important to understanding, I think, the entire crime. You mentioned, we know Kohberger, heard about him enough. Let's now talk about what happened to Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. And starting, Joe, with Kaylee Goncalves, her family, her parents have been outspoken. It was Kaylee's sister, at the victim impact statements, who just, I mean, was stronger than anyone I've ever had the chance to see in that environment at that time. And the whole family has acted. I would hope that in the similar circumstances, I would have the intestinal fortitude to be as they have been. They haven't been always polite. They have been very direct. A lot of the information that we know about this crime, even now, didn't come from investigators inside. We found it from the Goncalves family,
Yes,
who
we did.
reached out to get their own info. So starting with Kaylee Goncalves, Joe, the one question a lot of people have had: who was first attacked, and how did one person accomplish these 4 murders, when looking at the devastation, the destruction of the human beings? And as I mentioned, I think Kaylee may have been the target, and when you look at the autopsy, of each individual, I think it tells the tale there. Starting with Kaylee, what did you see, Joe, from a professional standpoint? What did you see in the autopsy report?
One of the things that comes down to, Dave, is the job that Dr. Veena Singh did, and that's the beauty, because she would have been the tour guide along the way, from a clinical standpoint, to talk about uh, the nature of these injuries, the enumeration of these injuries, and I don't mean that from a perspective of sequencing, like what order did they occur in, but just to document the devastation, all right, that she's seen before her eyes. Now, she's the chief medical examiner in Spokane, who this county has contract with, because it's the closest sizable city where there is a forensic pathologist, even though it's in another state, all right? And this is not
How does that
unheard
work,
of.
Joe?
Yeah.
Okay, I interrupted before you had a chance
No.
to clear, but I was
No.
surprised, because it's Moscow, Idaho,
Yeah.
but we have a Spokane, Washington
Yeah.
autopsy. How does that happen?
Well, because in Idaho, uh, there's not that many forensic pathologists. Now,
Okay.
you have them down in Boise, and there are probably a few that might live in Idaho that do private consulting. But we're talking about where's the closest location where you have a board certified
Okay.
forensic pathologist. And it's important to understand, because I think this has been a question that has occurred over time. Why did this happen? And one of the reasons is that there's not that many board certified forensic pathologists in the nation. People think that there's one on every every corner, and there's more neurosurgeons out there than there are forensic pathologists. There's
All right, now,
probably
well, who is
less than I'm sure there's less than 600 board certified nationwide.
Okay, that's a shocker. But who was the person that walked through the crime scene and announced to the world that that all the victims were attacked in their sleep? I thought it was a coroner, right? Wasn't that an
Yeah, it's a
elected
local
coroner?
coroner.
All right.
Yeah.
I would have
And
thought that the local coroner would be the person to do the autopsy, Joe.
No, she's not. She's not the person to do it. And she is, in fact, a registered nurse as well as an attorney. But
Yeah.
She is or was, I guess she's still in the position, but she's the eyes and the ears of the forensic pathologist at the scene, because Dr. Singh, to the best of my knowledge, never attended the scene, as the bodies were there.
Okay.
We would have heard something about that. And retrospectively, it probably would have been a good idea to have had, the pathologist brought over to see the bodies in situ, in place, in their pristine state. I think that would have been a fantastic idea, but if wishes were airplanes, we'd all be flying. And I really wonder, Dave, if that was ever a consideration, to say, look, you contact the Washington State Police and you say, put her in a unit right now, lights and sirens blasting all the way from Spokane to Idaho, to this location. We'll clear the roads for you. Get her here immediately. We want her to walk through the scene and see what has occurred here. And if that had happened, I think that would have been, or even put her on a helo. That these politicians in these states, they use helicopters all the time, and their state helicopters, they'll move from one event to the other, kissing babies or cutting ribbons and all this stuff. This is a case where you'd want to put the pathologist on the helo and get them there immediately. But yet I don't think that happened, because you can contextualize it at that moment in time. Doctor, just imagine how powerful that would have been, Dave. If she could have shown up at that scene in Moscow and seen the bodies in context, where they were laying, everything that had happened in those scenes that were awash in blood, and then taken that vision with her, and gone back to her office in Spokane and sat there and waited on the bodies to arrive. Now, I'm sure that, and when you have a case like this, or cases where it's a mass event, it's the morgue becomes a place. It's almost like it's almost there's a choreography to it, believe it or not, that you get into. There's like this rhythm, and you understand, and the choreography has to be spot on, where everybody knows their job. You would sit down with all of the personnel, with autopsy assistants, photographers, crime scene people from local jurisdictions that are going to show up. Everybody has their assignment, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to take victim 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we're not doing it because of that's the order they died in. We're going to do it because we're going to organize it so that for that moment in time, the number one victim that we're going to work on is all we're going to work on, because it's really easy to get distracted. And all of our friends out there, just think about any kind of event that you've ever been a part of. And it's a very important event, and you might have multiple segments to this event. Maybe you've planned it. It could be a wedding. It could be anything. And how you're always distracted thinking about, okay, I've got to go do the next thing, right? Well, you take something like that and apply it to death investigation, medical legal assessment, and there's a lot more riding on it. And so that's why it's so very important to have the forensic pathologist involved in a case like this. I just wish that the authorities, before they began to think about the next move there at the scene, like, when can we finish this up, is if they had paused just for a moment and physically brought a board certified forensic pathologist to the scene. You know, David, it would have been a fantastic thing to have had a forensic pathologist at the scene. But listen, you know, can't go back in time, right?
Right.
We can what if things to death, right?
Mm-hmm. But
And
I've got
that's
a
just
big
not the
question
case.
for you, Joe, for real about this, because
Please.
what you were just talking about. All right. When the bodies are brought to be examined, okay, they leave the home, they leave the place where they were killed. They're put in a body bag. They're transported to the lab, and their bodies are, I sound so just dry and clinical, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around this, you know, that once the body is there on the table and laid out, if you aren't told, okay, that this happened inside of a home, what information do you get as this autopsy is getting ready to begin? Because you've got injuries, you've got blood covering some. I mean, there's no telling what you're going to see. You don't know if this person jumped from a high rise, was hit on the sidewalk. You know, you don't know. But you've got a body with a lot of damage, and you have to figure out what happened. And by the way, in what order these things happened, or some degree of that, I'm guessing. But starting with Kaylee Goncalves, Joe, I read in the notes, and it was that her autopsy, that her injuries were worse than everybody. All of the injuries were horrible. Every injury that these 4 victims had, every one of them was horrible. And the one thing that we have known and we have talked about is that it appears Xana Kernodle fought back. And you're going to hear on the autopsy why we believe that and what the injuries are. But I have long believed that the target of this attack was on the 3rd floor and that it was Kaylee or Maddie, one of the two. Do we have any indication from the autopsy report that that might be accurate?
Well, I don't know that you can, if you're thinking about motivation of the perpetrator in a case like this, I don't necessarily know that we can definitively say that that one specific person was the target. I mean, and there are a lot of people out there that do that, but and understand the perspective that I come at this from is not a behavioral, perspective. It's from the perspective of the trauma. And I got to say, Dave, I can see why anybody that would read this report, and we already knew some of this, right?
Yeah.
But just in the first few paragraphs, all right, there's an opinion section. By the way, these reports are very well done. And I read a lot of autopsy reports, a lot of them, cases that folks are not aware of that I'm reading about. I get them and I'll read them.
Is it common that they have an opinion part?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. And unfortunately, some reports now are lacking. Dr. Singh obviously has got a very solid background relative to her training, her attention to detail. But just in this kind of overall assessment she does in her opinion portion relative to Kaylee's injuries, let me just kind of frame this for you. And we're only talking about scalp, face, and neck. Okay. That's all we're talking about here.
Okay.
Let that sink in before I give you a number. Scalp, face, and neck. The number of injuries is 24, but with this one caveat, 24 plus, which means that even in this controlled environment in which Dr. Singh conducted her examination, she could not give or provide a definitive number, like an absolute number. Okay. 24 plus. So that means that a lot of these insults that Kaylee sustained just to her head and neck area alone are communicating with one another. And what I mean by that is you've got a combination of blunt force. You've got the stab and incised wounds that are kind of overlapping. It's very, very confusing, when you think about this. So you've got these various elements that are kind of contacting one another, and some of them are more over the top than others. And so when you're looking at just the margin, say for instance of a slice, which is an incised wound, or stab, you might have an insult to the same area, but the nature of it would have characteristics of both slices and stabs. You see? And so that in and of itself makes this highly, and what, you're seeing this through, and that's kind of the utility of having a forensic pathologist here, because you're observing what she is writing down in her report. You're viewing this through her eyes at that moment in time. So that's like the importance of a forensic autopsy report, is you're being transported to that moment in time when the top tier person that is out there, that has the training and the wherewithal, is now giving you their view and their assessment of what you're seeing before you. Okay. And even with her esteemed ability, she could not give a definitive number just for the head, neck, and scalp, or the face, scalp, and neck, areas of the head. All right.
24
plus. Yeah.
God.
Yeah. And that's very important. And then, she goes from that point to where she gets to the chest, where definitively she says that Kaylee has sustained 11 stab and, again, incised injuries. Now, this is kind of an interesting point, okay, because when you're talking about sharp force injuries, and I think we did an entire episode on sharp force, if I'm not mistaken, but the nature of stab wounds and incised injuries are distinctly different. And just as kind of a refresher for our friends out there, stabs are deeper than long. Incised areas are generally longer than deep. Now, incised injuries can be, lethal, obviously, but they don't go as deep as stab wounds. So again, even when you get to the chest, you're talking about a combination of injuries. Now, she's given a definitive number for the ones to this young woman's chest. All right. 11. And so they're kind of cross communicating at that point in time, but yet there's a definitive number. And then there's 3 that she's identified relative to the upper extremities, where again, this is a combination of stab and incised injuries. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, Dave. The ferocity of these insults that she has sustained. You've got an individual that is taking a knife, and she believes that it's consistent. She says this in her report, that it is consistent with a K-bar knife. That's important to understand for all these cases. You're seeing the attitude of the knife actually change. Okay, just follow me here, because you're talking about somebody wielding a knife that is using it as a function of driving it in, which would be the stab wound, literally puncturing like this, to then taking the knife, and we don't know how it would be readjusted, or was it held in the same attitude where you take it and you can literally drag like the tip of the knife, leading edge, over the surface, and that gives you an incised insult. And so they're all clustered about, right? This autopsy in and of itself would have taken a protracted period of time to just do, and we're just talking about the external examination, because once Dr. Singh begins to examine the head and the face and these sorts of things, she then goes about, looking at the teeth and the tongue. And we've talked about this, I know, on Nancy shows multiple times, where we've got these kind of what I think are blunted or blunt force trauma, combined with probably a penetrating event going into the mouth itself. We're talking about loose teeth. We're talking about fractured bone. It would take, first off, a tremendous amount of energy, and it would also take a very robust weapon. You're not talking about using one of grandma's butter knives,
Right.
that comes with the set that you buy at the local store. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something that would have to have the robustness of something that is created as a weapon of war.
Joe, with regard to Kaylee Goncalves,
Yes,
there were notes made that her injuries, what was inflicted upon Kaylee, was substantially different than what the other victims had happened to them. Her nose was broken. A tooth was knocked out. Others were broken, made loose. She suffers blunt force injuries and asphyxiation.
Yeah.
Now, that again, now I've said this. I have long thought she was the primary target. And it is because of the injuries being a little different for her. But the one thing that keeps going on in my head is how these injuries were achieved by the suspect or the killer, while there's another person right there. Maddie was right there in the same physical environment as Kaylee when this was happening, which is why some people believe there had to be more than one. And I'm telling you, all the evidence points to only one person in there. And that only one person was Kohberger. There is no evidence pointing to a second suspect. The injuries in and of themselves are just a flurry. And it reminds me of the Ted Bundy in Florida at the Chi Omega house.
Yeah.
And what he went in there, where it was a frenzied attack. He grabbed a daggone piece of firewood as he walked into the house and did damage to these girls in such a way that was just unbelievable. And I see that same type of frenzy.
Yeah, I thought about the same thing too. My friend, I mentioned earlier, Kathy Kleiner. By the way, a big shout out to her.
Amazing woman.
There's so many people, out there that talk about how brave somebody is. You don't know brave.
Yeah.
You don't know brave. You go take a look at the life that Kathy's had to live, and she's lived a good life too. And what she endured. And, I've thought about, and there have been a lot of, linkages by behaviorists that are out there that say, he's very similar. And anytime I see cases like this, one of the things that I always think about is the term that we use with overkill. And some behaviorists actually associate this with almost a frenzied attack, and then someone will say a sexual frenzied attack, even though there's no kind of physical sexual assault. It's these behaviors will say that it's driven. Back in the do you remember? Well, not that we would remember, but they used to, newspapers would use terms like lust murder. You hear that term, that's thrown out there, and that goes to the kind of this fevered thing, this frenzied thing, that goes on. I think one of the elements to this case, when you're talking about Matt and Kaylee, we have to understand that they had alcohol on board, a considerable amount of alcohol. And so with Kaylee, for instance, she's a little video thing, right? And she is inebriated, and her injuries that she sustained, which I'll get to in a second, but the injuries she sustained, I don't know if there was necessarily um, a lot of fighting that was put up on her part, uh, to the degree that we see with Kaylee. I think that um, Kaylee, had an awareness. I think that she resisted. You know, if one of these two women were the targets, I think that she had an awareness that this was happening. Little old Maddie, I think that she sustained um, a pretty serious injuries to both the lung and the liver with her. I think that and plus with her, her subclavicular artery was nicked. We talked about that recently, um, with this Clinty case, down in Florida, and how that can, take life like this if you get into any of these vascular structures in the neck, subclave in particular. They're going to bleed out really, really quickly. But the injuries, continue on beyond that. But with Kaylee, one of the interesting things about her that are these injuries to the mouth, because there's this kind of unidentified thing that has been placed, that Dr. Singh talks about, that has been placed across her mouth. And we've heard, I think over time, there have been a couple of people, and I don't know if this came from Steve or who it came from, Steve Gonzalez. There was some kind of pattern injury there. I think some people said it was circular or curved, and I can't recall off the top of my head. But I think back to the way a K-bar handle is made, and it's got these kind of deep grooves on the handle. And I often thought maybe that was placed into her mouth. It was used as maybe some type of tool to punch her with, because one of the things they're talking about, Dave, or that Dr. Singh, finds, is that she actually uses the term suffocating.
Right.
And so this is kind of not only do we have blunt force trauma, we've got incised wounds, we've got penetrating stab wounds, we've got this kind of fracturing amount around the mouth and the face and everything. We've also got a suffocating event too. And if there's signs of suffocation, Dave, that means that she was alive. Because that's one of the ways, we look for things like petechiae, we look for like things in strap muscles of the neck, and, all these various things, purple discoloration, all these sorts, and those things can only occur in life, right? And so there's so much going on with Kaylee, Dave.
Right. So do you think, based on something being put over her mouth, that as the attack begins, covering her mouth and then the blunt force trauma follow, to the head? And I mean, in my head, I'm picturing if he's covering her mouth to prevent her from screaming, that's all I can think of. And then the attack goes from there and it becomes more frenzied. That's why her attack, the attack on Kaylee, was different than the others. And again, the things that we'll never know. But again, I never thought we'd see the autopsy reports either.
No, brother, I got to tell you, brother Dave, I didn't see it either. I didn't see it coming. I really didn't. I think about this, and the sheer volume of trauma in this case. I got to tell you, I got to say this clearly right now, because I've had other people ask me this question. Have you ever seen anything like this? Well, to this point, I haven't had this kind of data to do the assessment. So now I can affirmatively say no. Not with the number of victims that we have and the level of trauma that has been assessed by Dr. Singh. It's really, it really catches one's eye, because you think about it, and it's not just It's not just the number of injuries, it's the number of injuries that occurred in a very short window of time. That's why you would, I think that you would have to make the assessment that this is these insults, these injuries are at the hands of somebody that was in a frenzied state. That's my thought, relative to just Kaylee and Maddie, upstairs in this home, Dave. Friends, I got to tell you, it's hard to plumb the depths of what we're seeing with these reports, and we want to make sure that, and I think Brother Dave agrees with me, that we want to spend an appropriate amount of time on each one of these victims, because as you remember, our focus is not on the individual that's currently doing time, that has taken responsibility for these homicides. Our focus is on the victims, okay? And the sheer depth and breadth of what happened to Kaylee, we want to spend enough time on the other three victims. So we're going to be wrapping this episode up at this point in time, and we are going to be doing a part 2. And we'll spend a sufficient amount of time talking about not just the injuries, but some of the other things that Dr. Singh found at Autopsy. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bag.